as their guest, Demodocus sings a song. And this song, at first glance, looks very immoral, very disrespectful of the god. In fact, Plato, or Socrates, cites this story as one of the examples in Homer which make Homer's work unfit in his Republic, which he is developing with his interlocutors in the Republic, the dialogue called the Republic. This is a story about illicit love between a god and a goddess. But when you look at what the gods and goddesses stand for, the story is very instructive. One has to remember in this story that Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is married to Hephaestus, the blacksmith of the gods. Ares is the god of war. In fact, there are some people who feel that Demodocus, the minstrel, was a kind of self-portrait by Homer. He was blind and is here described. As the minstrel touched the lyre, he lifted up his voice in sweet song, and he sang of the love of Ares and Aphrodite, of the fair crown, how at first they lay together in the house of Hephaestus privily. And Ares gave her many gifts, and dishonoured the marriage bed of the lord Hephaestus. And anon there came to him one to report the thing, even the sun god Helios, who sees all, that had seen them at their pastime. Now when Hephaestus heard the bitter tidings, he went his way to the forge, devising evil in the deep of his heart, and set up the great anvil, and wrought fetters that none might snap or loosen, that the lovers might there unmovably remain. Now when he had the crafty net in his anger against Ares, he went on his way to the chamber where his marriage bed was set out, and strewed his snares all about the posts of the bed, and many too were hung aloft from the main beam, subtle as spiders' webs, so that none might see them, even of the blessed gods. So cunningly were they forged. Now after he had done winding the snare about the bed, he made as though he would go to Lemnos, that stablished castle, and this was far the dearest of all lands in his sight. But Ares of the golden rein kept no blind watch, what time he saw Hephaestus, the famed craftsman, depart afar. So he went on his way to the house of renowned Hephaestus, eager for the love of crowned Aphrodite. Now she was but newly come from her sire, the mighty Zeus, and as it chanced, had sat her down. And Ares entered the house, and clasped her hand, and spake, and hailed her. Come, my beloved, let us to bed, and take our pleasure of love. For Hephaestus is no longer among his own people. Methinks he is already gone to Lemnos, to the Sintians, men of savage speech. So spake he, and a glad thing it seemed to her to lie with him. So they twain went to the couch, and laid them to sleep, and round them clung the cunning bonds of a skilled Hephaestus, so that they could not move, nor raise a limb. Then at last they knew it, when there was no way to flee. Now the famous god of the strong arms drew near to them, having turned him back ere he reached the land of Lemnos. For Helios kept watch and told him all. So heavy at heart he went his way to his house, and stood at the entering in of the gate, and wild rage gat hold of him, and he cried terribly and shouted to all the gods, Father Zeus, and ye other blessed gods that live for ever, come hither, that ye may see a mirthful and cruel thing. For Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, ever dishonors me by reason of my lameness, and sets her heart on Ares the destroyer, because he is fair and straight of limb. But as for me, lame was I born. Howbeit, there is none to blame but my father and mother. Would they had never begotten me. But now shall ye see where these have gone up into my bed, and sleep together in love, and I am troubled at the sight. Yet methinks they will not care to lie thus even for a little while longer, despite their great love. Soon will they have no desire to sleep together, but the snare and the bond shall hold them, till her sire give back to me the gifts of wooing, one and all, those that I bestowed upon him for the hand of his shameless girl, for that his daughter is fair, but without discretion. So spake he, and lo, the gods gathered together to the house of the brazen floor. Poseidon came, the girdler of the earth, and Hermes came, the bringer of luck, and Prince Apollo came, the archer. But the lady goddesses abode each within her house for shame. So the gods, the givers of good things, stood on the porch, and laughter unquenchable arose among the blessed gods, as they beheld the sleight of cunning Hephaestus. This sounds like a very immoral portrayal of divinity. And at face value it is. And it was face value that Socrates or Homer was concerned about. People hearing this story of the gods and going away and acting likewise. But for those who look a bit deeper and consider what the gods and goddesses represent, this story has a very good lesson. Aphrodite, remember, is the goddess of love. She represents all that is lovely in this creation. Ares, as the god of war, represents the impulse in us to take and enjoy what is not ours. Hephaestus, as the blacksmith of the gods, represents the handiwork of the gods, the working out of divine law, particularly of Zeus's will, which recompenses every action with its consequence. So the story illustrates how all the lovely things of the creation are there to be enjoyed, but only lawfully. When we take for our enjoyment that which is not rightfully ours, then we soon find ourselves bound and eventually humiliated through the working of the universal laws, through these bonds and fetters which are too fine to see, but are definitely there, binding us when we grab more than is rightfully ours. Homer teaches the principle that the taker is taken. To jump to another civilization, the concept of karma, where every action has its recompense, whether it's met in this life or the next, is a similar message, that all is here to be enjoyed, but what is taken, when it is not your own, binds you. Finally, what is the effect upon the reader or the hearer of these tales? What is the effect of Homer's portrayal of the gods and goddesses in this way? One thing that strikes one is the dignity and wonder given to ordinary life. Ordinary life is elevated and magnified through the sense of the divine present everywhere, in nature and in us. For example, when Odysseus, having lost all his men through their foolishness, is washed up upon the shore of the island Phaeacia, he sees the princess Nausicaa with her attendants. They are on the beach washing the clothes of the royal family. He considers how to approach her, for he now is desolate. He's lost all his goods, even his clothes. Despite his dreadful condition, he addresses her with words of divine graciousness. "I supplicate thee, O Queen," he says, "whenever that weather..." Sorry, I'll start that again. He approaches her first and addresses her with these words. "I supplicate thee, O Queen, whether thou art a goddess or a mortal. If indeed thou art a goddess, of them that keep the wide heaven, to Artemis, then, the daughter of great Zeus, I mainly liken thee, for beauty and stature and shapeliness. But if thou art one of the daughters of men who dwell on earth, thrice blessed are thy father and thy lady mother, and thrice blessed thy brethren. Surely their souls ever glow with gladness for thy sake, each time they see thee entering the dance, so fair a flower of maidens. But he is of heart the most blessed beyond all others, who shall prevail with gifts of wooing, and lead thee to his home. Never have mine eyes beheld such a one among mortals, neither man nor woman. Great awe comes upon me as I look on thee." She welcomes him and advises how he should seek help from her parents. Here is how she describes her parents in a noble and, again, in a divine way. This is how Odysseus will find her parents in the palace. "When thou art within the shadow of the halls and the court, pass quickly through the great chamber, till thou comest to my mother, who sits at the hearth in the light of the fire, weaving yarn of sea-purple stain, a wonder to behold. Her chair is leaning against a pillar, and her maidens sit behind her. And there my father's throne leans close to hers, wherein he sits and drinks his wine, like an immortal." As a last example, here is Odysseus' description of how he and his men sailed into the harbor of the island off the coast of the land of the Cyclops. Notice how, simply by making allusion to the divine, the sense of wonder in this description is increased. It could be described in many ways. It could be described very prosaically. This is how Homer describes it. "Now, at the head of the harbor is a well of bright water issuing from a cave, and round it are poplars growing. Thither we sailed, and some god guided us through the night, for it was dark and there was no light to see, a mist lying deep about the ships. Nor did the moon show her light from heaven, but was shut in with clouds. No man then beheld that island, neither saw we the long waves rolling to the beach, till we had run our decked ships ashore. And when our ships were beached, we took down all their sails, and ourselves too stepped forth upon the strand of the sea. And there we fell into sound sleep, and waited for the bright dawn." We have seen how Homer portrayed the divine world, and how he shows it interacting with the world of men. Just by way of conclusion, we have come a long way over the centuries in understanding laws of nature, how things work. But in some ways, perhaps we have not come that far, because perhaps we've come a little bit too clinical in our analysis of the world. Have we perhaps lost a sense of the magic and wonder of life by trying to perform dissection on what is a breathing thing? Our search to understand ourselves and the world will continue, will flourish. Each generation will bring its new discoveries. Homer, however, can help us to preserve and inspire an appreciation of the simple beauty of life and the justice which is behind it all and regulates it. He can perhaps help us not to lose sight of the wonder of life, the gloriousness of life which has been produced somehow or other out of that which is beyond it, sustains it, created it. Although Homer does not speak as a philosopher writing a treatise, through his stories one can find direction towards that which is beyond this physical creation, to that which produced this physical creation out of itself. And one can find direction in living a life which is in accord with that which is beyond this creation, which is able to sustain the difficulties that we meet in life, which are bound to be on the way, and also to use life for the good and to help others do the same. Thank you for listening so patiently. What we will do now is have a break for some refreshments and then meet again to give you an opportunity to ask any questions and to give me an opportunity to attempt to answer them. Well, are there any questions or points you'd like to raise?
Since you mentioned that the story was sang, is there any indication of what the song sounded like?
The question is, I'd mentioned that these stories were sung. Is there any indication of what the song sounded like? Unfortunately, there is no record of this. We know that the stories were sung to a lyre. We know the rhythm of the lines of poetry, but we really don't know any more than that. These songs would be sung around the fire in the evening as the minstrel went from one town to the next, and would be their entertainment and also their education. But we don't know what the music sounded like. Anything else?
Is there any trace of it in Greek music or Greek music going back to now, say 700 or 800 years?
Yes, the question is whether there is any indication from later music in Greece, maybe going back 700 or 800 years. There is a single line of music. I believe it's from the hymn to either Apollo or Dionysus. And just a few notes, because even the way music was written was different. And this dates from, I believe actually, it goes back as far as the 3rd century BC. But there's not an awful lot to go on. If you go to productions of Greek drama, you often hear the chorus singing their lines to strains of music. This is an approximation of what it was like in the 5th century BC, which was 300 years later than Homer. But that's as close as we can get.
What are the oldest records of these gods? I mean, can they be traced back way before the time of Homer? Do we know where they emerged from?
The gods can be traced back only through the written records we have in the Greek culture. But that Greek culture, for a long time, was an oral culture as opposed to literary culture. Homer was the first to write down these epics, but they had been sung for centuries before him. A man called Hesiod wrote the genealogy of the gods. He wrote about the same time as Homer, and that's the earliest record we have of the hierarchy of the gods, who they were. That, of course, will be what he received from centuries of oral tradition. If you go across cultures, you can go further back to records in the Vedic tradition, and there are many similarities. And in reading works from many different cultures, you get the sense of various functions which were portrayed as gods and goddesses. And though they had different names, they seem to relate to each other right across civilizations and centuries. But again, what we have are written records which are only putting down what had been going on for centuries orally before that. So in the Greek civilization, we can go back perhaps to 1000 or 1500 BC in what we find in Hesiod and Homer. In the Vedic tradition, there is some dispute as to when the Veda were written down, but it would seem we can go back earlier than that, to around 3000 BC. It's just worth mentioning in passing that the oral tradition is a very precise and reliable tradition. In our literary age, we have forgotten to learn things by heart, for the most part. But still in India, there are families which have the job of looking after the purity of the texts, the various religious texts. And they've done this over millennia. And they recite these texts continually. And whenever publishers, regularly, every 50 or 100 years, there is a convention of publishers, and they check their written versions against the spoken, recited version of the families, because they're so much more precise. And they notice mistakes have got into the printing, and they amend it. And then they carry on for another 50 years. The mind, when it is used fully in this way, is far more precise than any human activity involving presses, proofreading, all this sort of thing. And in the early part of this century, when studies were made of epics in the Slavic countries, it was found that there were minstrels who did the same thing that Homer did and sang tales going back many, many years. And they would have competitions every now and then. And these singers of tales could sing continuously for days, never repeating themselves, always singing in the proper meter. And they would carry the tradition. It's just worth mentioning that, because having relied on the written word, it's rather easy to think that the oral tradition is something which is not very reliable, but in fact it's very reliable. So when the oral tradition finally got written down by Homer and by Vyasa in the Vedantic tradition, what is written down is fairly reliable. Or at least it was at the time. It may have become unreliable through publication and republication since.
May I ask, did these people really believe in these gods, or did they know that they just myths and symbols?
Did the Greeks really believe in these gods, or did they think of them as symbols and myths? That's the question. This is a very good question, because it begs another question. What do you mean by the gods? Did the Greeks believe in the gods? And if you mean by that, did they believe that the gods were exactly as Homer shows them in the story, running around doing this, that, and the other thing? The answer is probably no. But if you mean, did they believe in the gods as forces symbolized by these anthropomorphic images in literature? And probably yes. For example, this is something that you and I have to face ourselves. When we were young and heard about God, almost all of us formed an image of a great being, a man, a white beard and white robes, sitting somewhere up in the clouds. And this is the God who one would pray to and who would punish and reward. And at a very young age, this image is formed. Would that be right? Is this something you remember from your experience? So here, God is this bigger than human, who's really God and all-powerful. And who knows everything. Somehow, even though he's sitting up there on the clouds, he knows everything that's going on, even behind the bicycle shed. As we grow up, reason begins to dawn in us. And we look at this God and we say, hang on a minute, this just is not reasonable. I don't believe there is a chap sitting up there with white clothes and a beard, seeing everything, knowing everything. It's ridiculous. At that point, the mistake is often made that you say, therefore I don't believe in God. What you really should say is, I don't believe in that image of God. Because then one can say, well, what is God then? Who is God? What is it? Instead of chucking the whole thing out.
Could I just ask you, is that something much more modern? I mean, when I was much younger, people went to church every Sunday, and they believed in the prayers, which were all basically to do with God and Christ.
Yes.
They didn't question it. But nowadays, things are completely different, much more materialistic.
Yes, that's right. People throw out the view of God sitting up in the clouds with white clothes and leave it at that. They don't persevere and say, well, okay, of course that's a ridiculous sort of infantile view of something which is so almighty that it actually created this creation. It can't be. They don't then persevere and say, well, the scriptures are there directing our minds to something. What do you think they're saying? Now, in the same way, the Greeks come to the stories. The gods are represented as these people. And some of the Greeks will have said, oh, that's ridiculous. I don't believe that Athena walks around with a helmet, or that Zeus is throwing thunderbolts up there. Some of them will have rejected that and not believed at all, will not have inquired. But the wiser of the Greeks, as the wiser of us nowadays, will say, fine, these are stories, this is the way the unspeakable is spoken. This is how one tries to portray that which is inexpressible in expressions. Now, what are the gods really? What are they standing for? So I think the Greeks did believe in gods at that time, but not literally, just as people who believe in God now, adults who believe in God now, usually have transcended the kind of man in the sky view and have penetrated to a fuller meaning of what God is and how he works in us and through us.
Of course, the Greeks did build temples to these gods and sacrificed to them.
Yes, the Greeks built temples and sacrificed to them, just as we build churches. And these temples were considered to be the house of the god or goddess to whom it was consecrated, just as we talk about the church being God's house. That was another problem I had. When I went to church, I was going to God's house, but on the other hand, I thought he was everywhere or knew everything. So why is he just here and not there? As a child, these kind of views are problems because one's image of God is the problem. But the Greeks worshipped, they sacrificed, they bowed down to these powers, respected them, and this worship and these powers in turn guided their behavior, just as our worship of the divine does now. But the wonderful question, the question which can become a quest for life, an adventure for life, is who is God? Or who are the gods, really? Where are they? And it takes you beyond just the written word of the text, whether it's the Bible or Homer or the Veda or the Quran. It takes you into real experience of this divinity, beyond just ideas and concepts.
These gods then are forces, are they?
Yes.
Then can one not just think of them as forces instead of being overpowered with all this amount of... I can't, you see, I loved your lecture, but really, I haven't really taken it in. It's too complicated.
Yes. Well, one of our difficulties is that we try to take things in. We try to understand things by wresting meaning from it or analyzing it or getting it all sorted out. Now, that approach is quite useful for some things, for example, scientific analysis. But on other things, another approach is better. And that is not an analytical approach or an attempt to unravel and understand everything in neat, orderly setting. But to take the Odyssey, for example, take that first, which is more immediately appealing than the Iliad, and to read it, preferably with some others, just a gathering of friends and just reading it, parts of it, and letting the sense of it come through, putting the analytical mind on the side and just listening and letting the wonder and magic of it come over. Because what happens is that when you put these great works down and you go about your daily life, you find that it's had an effect in the way you see things. It lifts the way you see people and things out of the very ordinary into something which has got a touch of magic and divinity about it. And that's a wonderful thing to have in life. And not worry too much about, well, the Greek tradition has the goddess of wisdom as Athena, and she does this and does that. But the Vedantic tradition has Saraswati as the goddess of wisdom, and she does that. Now, this is a big problem. I can't work it out. How am I to understand this? I mean, how does it all make sense? And in a way, you're missing the whole point of it by just going to each work in its own right, living with it, listening to it, not analyzing.
Just absorbing it.
That's right. And there's a level of mind which is actually above this busy activity of analysis and so-called understanding, which tries to pick things to pieces. It's an immediate part of mind. It's a part of mind which recognizes things immediately. It's the sense of what is right, recognition of something as being so, which isn't a matter of working it out in a logical sequence. So I wouldn't worry about having taken it in or not. What I hope would happen with the lecture is that you'd be encouraged just to go to Homer and read the Odyssey and the Iliad and enjoy it. Not try to understand it, because like any good thing, there is no end to its appreciation. Every time you come to it again, it's deeper and richer and makes life deeper and richer for you.
Well, I haven't got much time yet, but I'll try.
Yes.
Could you comment on the role of Hephaestus in this then? Because I noticed that there are a couple of things said about him, that he's strong-armed,
Yes.
he's lame,
Yes.
he's married to Aphrodite. How do those things sort of fit together?
The question is, how can you fit together the various descriptions of Hephaestus as being strong-armed and yet lame, of being married to the goddess of love and yet being cheated on? Some of this I don't think one ever really does understand. Another aspect of Hephaestus is he was thrown out of heaven. He was thrown from Mount Olympus because his mother, Hera, thought he was so ugly with his deformity. And so Hephaestus built his mother a golden throne and gave it to her, and she accepted that, but she still didn't accept him back into Mount Olympus. Until she discovered that having sat down on the throne, she couldn't get up again. So she led him back into Mount Olympus. There are all sorts of wonderful descriptions of these goings-on, and one of the tendencies one has to resist is the attempt to nail things down too much, because not that one should be airy-fairy about all this and anything goes, that's not right either, but that these stories, rather like parables of Jesus and Zen stories, they have a basic interpretation one can make, but there are also levels of interpretation, and the interpretation which is right for you at your level, say, may be slightly different from someone else who's got another level of understanding, either more profound or less profound than you. And what's classic about an epic is that it is a work of art, whether it's painting or music or literature, which speaks meaningfully to all ages of life and ages of wisdom, so that it's, as it were, it evolves with your evolution of wisdom. And it means more and more when you come back to it. It just doesn't mean one thing and that's it. That's not a classic. That doesn't stand the test of the ages like the classics do. So that one could look at this in various contexts. Look at Hephaestus as a character. See all sorts of lessons one can take from it. And that's valid. As long as one isn't saying, oh, well, this is the final truth about that story. Because you'll find that with all these Greek myths, there are many versions of them. And as a student of classics, you can be terribly frustrated because you want to know the final authoritative truth about Hephaestus. You don't like all these different versions. It's too untidy, too many footnotes. But you sort of grow a bit older and wiser and realize that the truth isn't something which is nailed down like that. It's something which is wonderful and without end in its ever-growing richness. And so you let these stories be in the same way.
But can I just say something about that? The idea of discovering the strength and the lameness. I mean, I at my age am now discovering the strength and the lameness within me. The idea of it just being one, and that maybe this symbol was created just so that we could see that. Like strength, lameness can be just as strong. You look at the blind cabinet minister at the moment in the Labour Party. That can be just as strong.
Yes, that's very good. That's a very valid way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is. That's very good. I like that. I was just trying to get it in the context of your view on Hephaestus being the workings of nature, being workings of God, trying to translate it into concrete fact. He's actually making things happen, and maybe that process is bound to be imperfect. That's one of those articles.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and just what comes to mind, but this may not bear out on reflection, is that Hephaestus is the blacksmith of the gods, and but he is not independent. He very much carries out the will of Zeus. So, in other words, he doesn't walk on his own. He's lame in the sense that he is not independent of proceeding, not of independent procedure. That may be one way of looking at it. Certainly in the story of Ares and Aphrodite, it makes sense if you see his trick as spinning these fine fetters for the two miscreants, as being in fact a working out of Zeus's justice. That gives richness and meaning to the story. If it's just Hephaestus getting his own back, this lame chap who was taken advantage of by his beautiful wife and this strong Chippendale Ares, it doesn't mean so much. Yes?
We're told about the father of the gods, and no more. He doesn't seem to appear anymore. The father of Zeus and the other, Poseidon and Hades. Does he have only a very brief appearance in this?
The father of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades was Kronos, and his father was Uranus. We don't hear much of them in Homer, but in the Greek mythology they do appear to some degree in terms of explaining the lineage, genealogy of the gods. Uranus, the grandfather of Zeus, means heaven. And I believe his wife was Earth. Kronos is actually not spelt with the same letter, which is the word chronos, meaning time. But it may, in fact, be the same concept, and there's just been a change in the spelling or pronunciation over the years. So you have Zeus, which supports, sustains all living things as being the son of time, grandson of heaven and earth. But here, as with all myths and stories of the creation, one has to be a little bit careful of looking for the final authoritative explanation of how the divine and physical world came into being. The virtue of these myths of creation seem to be that they show how this vast creation is a passing thing. It came into existence, is dependent, is interdependent, and under the law of birth and growth, maturity, decay, and death. And all these myths can have the effect of turning our minds to look for that which is beyond this law of birth, growth, maturity, decay, and death, and seek that in us and in the world which is eternal and never changes. That's the real value of these creation myths.
If we want to read the Odyssey, what translation would you recommend?
The question is, what translation would I recommend for reading the Odyssey and the Iliad? The translation which I was quoting from for the Iliad was a 19th century translation by Lang, Leaf and Myers, and for the Odyssey was a Victorian translation by Butcher and Lang. Now these have a very grand sense about them. You probably noted, I know one gentleman mentioned the similarity in expression with these translations and the Old Testament. For us, I find that the Penguin translations are very, very good, very readable, some of them quite poetic, without being slightly remote, which these Victorian translations can be. Is excellent, and really, if you can, read it aloud with a friend or two. That's wonderful, because the whole thing just comes to life, and that is in fact how it was originally done. A singer sitting by the hearth singing.